Channel, and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 27, is about Canada's continued relationship to the American Revolution. This will be part 3 of our journey. Now, before we start, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw and heard in the last episode. We learned that the American Continental Congress approved a full-scale invasion of Canada, and that in a two-pronged attack, they advanced on both Montreal and Quebec City in September of 1775. We also learned that the Americans laid a successful siege on Montreal, but met with a massive failure when they attacked Quebec City, and that the Americans completely withdrew from Canada on July 2, 1776, and just 2 days later, on July 4th, they issued their Declaration of Independence. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at the Loyalists now. As a point of interest, the American Revolution can be seen as a civil war as much as it was a war against Great Britain. As the rebels gained more control, they became angry with their fellow Americans who remained loyal to Great Britain. Here in Canada, we call these Americans Loyalists, while the Americans called them Tories. In 1778, King Louis XVI of France signed a mutual defense pact with the Americans, turning a civil war into a world war. Then, in 1781, the British became trapped in Yorktown, Virginia, as they attacked the Americans. The British were surrounded on land and sea by both Americans and French troops, and after great losses, the British surrendered. For France, this felt like an addition of a final chapter to the previous 7 years' war they had with Great Britain. After the Battle of Yorktown, the rebel Americans continued to gain strength. Then, by 1783, the British Army and thousands of Loyalists fell back to New York City. This was the English's last stronghold in the 13 colonies. Guy Carleton, who was the governor of British province of Quebec, was now the commander of the British forces in America. He managed to hold off George Washington long enough to arrange a mass evacuation of the British people. British ships crowded the docks as refugees piled in. Nearly 100,000 Loyalists fled the United States during the final days of the American Revolution. Some 50,000 of these went north into Canada, into Nova Scotia, which at this time included New Brunswick. Great Britain had also issued a proclamation promising freedom and sanctuary to any slaves who deserted their American masters, and approximately 3,500 slaves joined the Loyalists. The Loyalists founded the town of Shelburne, near the southern tip of Nova Scotia. Shelburne started out as a boomtown with all the refugees coming in, but within 3 years, most settlers moved on, leaving Shelburne all but deserted. By definition, the Loyalists were more like political refugees, and Quebec's governor, Frederick Haldimand, wanted them to keep moving on. The Loyalists were notoriously anti-French, and Haldimand didn't want them settling among the habitants. Haldimand sent an expedition to survey for a settlement along the north shore of Lake Ontario. Here, in 1783, Kingston, Ontario would be founded. Other Loyalists moved to the sparsely populated area of the southwest region of the province of Quebec. This would later become known as the Eastern Townships of Quebec. The impacts of the Loyalists on Canadian society was huge. They would change the dynamics of British North America, or Canada, forever. The vast numbers of English-speaking immigrants would be much greater than the small number of English merchants that we saw in Montreal earlier. The Loyalists would be responsible for creating the English-Canadian traditions and attitudes that still exist today. They were more conservative and more anti-American than the French Canadians were. This influx of Loyalists into Nova Scotia was so great that 2 new colonies had to be created. New Brunswick was carved out of the territory of Nova Scotia in 1784, and also in 1784, Cape Breton Island was made a separate colony. Cape Breton would eventually be returned to Nova Scotia in 1820, though. As mentioned in an earlier video, there were 2 treaties of Paris. The first we saw in 1763 ended the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France. This 1783 Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution between Great Britain and the United States. The entire Ohio Valley, which belonged to Canada, was ceded to the Americans. The border was now drawn at the Great Lakes. And the British betrayed their native allies. They handed over lands of the Iroquois and other native lands to the Americans, land they did not own. And the Americans promised to compensate the Loyalists who had been forced to leave, but they didn't. Well, that's it for this episode. Let's summarize. In this episode, we saw that in 1778, King Louis XVI of France signed a mutual defense pact with the Americans, and that in 1781, the British became trapped in Yorktown, Virginia, as they attacked the Americans. The British lose to a combined force of Americans and French soldiers. By 1783, the British Army and thousands of Loyalists fall back to New York City, and a mass exodus begins, with nearly 100,000 Loyalists fleeing the United States during the final days of the American Revolutions. Some 50,000 head north into Canada. We saw that Quebec's governor, Frederick Haldimand, did not want the Loyalists, who were notoriously anti-French, settling among the habitants, so he sent an expedition to survey for a settlement along the north shore of Lake Ontario in 1783, where Kingston, Ontario would be founded. Other Loyalists moved to the southwest region of the province of Quebec, which would later become known as the Eastern Townships of Quebec. We also saw that the Loyalists would be responsible for creating the English-Canadian traditions and attitudes that still exist today, and that in 1784, New Brunswick was carved out of the territory of Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton Island was made a separate colony. Both new colonies were created to accommodate the large number of Loyalist refugees. And finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed and ended the American Revolution between Great Britain and the United States. And as part of this, the British ceded the entire Ohio Valley, which belonged to Canada, to the Americans. Now, please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 28, where we jumped into the American Revolution, part 3, and its continued impacts on Canada. In this episode, we'll look into the creation of Upper Canada and the Constitutional Act of 1791. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.